For thousands of years, humanity looked to the skies and dared to imagine the impossible. That one day we too might leave the earth behind. What followed was a centuries-long obsession that would ultimately reshape the entire world. In the late 15th century, Leonardo da Vinci filled thousands of notebook pages with remarkably sophisticated designs for flying machines, studying bird anatomy with scientific precision. Though never built in his lifetime, his ornithopter concepts and aerial screw sketches proved that the engineering imagination of humanity was centuries ahead of its materials. On November 21, 1783, the Montgolfier brothers' hot air balloon carried 2 passengers on the first confirmed free flight in human history, drifting over Paris for 25 minutes before a crowd of hundreds of thousands. This singular moment shattered the ancient boundary between human beings and the open sky. English engineer Sir George Cayley dedicated decades of his life to understanding the fundamental principles of lift, drag, and stability, essentially inventing the modern concept of the fixed-wing aircraft in the early 1800s. By 1853, he had constructed a full-scale glider that briefly carried his coachman across a Yorkshire valley. The first recorded human flight in a heavier than aircraft. German aviation pioneer Otto Lilienthal completed over 2,000 successful glider flights between 1891 and 1896, systematically recording aerodynamic data that would influence every aircraft designer who followed him. His death in a glider crash in 1896 was a tragedy that nonetheless inspired a generation of inventors, including 2 bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio. Orville and Wilbur Wright operated a modest bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio, but their evenings and weekends were consumed by an increasingly rigorous scientific pursuit of powered flight. Unlike dreamers before them, they built their own wind tunnel, tested dozens of wing profiles, and approached each failure as data to be analyzed rather than defeat. On the morning of December 17, 1903, at Kill Devil Hills near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, Orville Wright piloted the flyer into a cold headwind and remained airborne for 12 seconds, covering a distance of 120 feet. It was the first sustained, controlled, powered flight of a heavier than air aircraft, and the world would never be the same. Within little more than a decade of Kitty Hawk, aviation had been weaponized on an industrial scale across the battlefields of Europe, with dedicated fighter aircraft, reconnaissance planes, and early bombers transforming the nature of warfare forever. The desperate military demand for faster, more reliable aircraft drove aeronautical engineering forward at a pace that peacetime never could have matched. On May 20, 1927, Charles Lindbergh climbed into the Spirit of St. Louis and completed the first solo non-stop transatlantic flight from New York to Paris in 33.5 hours, instantly becoming the most famous person on Earth. His achievement ignited a global obsession with aviation and opened the public imagination to the possibility of routine long-distance air travel. Through the late 1920s and 1930s, airlines such as Pan American, Lufthansa, and Imperial Airways began offering scheduled passenger services, transforming aviation from a daredevil spectacle into a commercial industry. Flying remained expensive and exclusive, but for those who could afford it, the world had suddenly become dramatically, thrillingly smaller. The Second World War demanded aircraft of unprecedented speed, range, and destructive power, compressing decades of engineering progress into just 6 years. By 1945, aviation had produced pressurized cabins, long-range heavy bombers, and the earliest operational jet-powered aircraft. In 1952, the British de Havilland Comet became the world's first commercial jet airliner, carrying passengers at altitudes and speeds utterly beyond the reach of any propeller-driven aircraft. The jet age had arrived, promising to shrink the world once more and redefine what ordinary people might expect from air travel. When Boeing 707 entered transatlantic service in 1958, jet travel became accessible to a rapidly growing middle class, collapsing journey times from days to hours. For the first time in history, crossing an ocean was something millions of ordinary people could genuinely aspire to do. The Boeing 747 entering service in 1970 carried over 400 passengers per flight and fundamentally democratized long-haul aviation by driving ticket prices to levels previously unimaginable. Tourism, global commerce, and human migration were transformed overnight by a single aeroplane. From Otto Lilienthal's fragile glider to carbon fiber jets carrying hundreds of passengers across continents in hours, aviation has compressed time and distance in ways no previous generation could have imagined. In little more than a century, humanity transformed the dream of flight into the most remarkable feat of engineering in all of recorded history.